Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. So for today's presentation, we have Rei Tang and Mark Conway. They're going to be talking, they're climate change program officers for the Stanley Center for Peace and Security. And today they're going to be speaking to us on how climate change is changing international politics. I am Megan Phillips. I am your interim director for ICFRC this year and hosting today's program. This is my first time, so... So we would like to take a moment to thank our members, volunteers, and interns for making these forums possible. And I would like to acknowledge our university and community supporters, including the University of Iowa Honors Program, the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, U Iowa International Programs, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their financial support. And then I also would like to thank today's special sponsors, which is an anonymous donation in honor of Ed Zastro. So today, it is my pleasure to introduce Rei Tang and Mark Conway. Rei Tang is a program officer for climate change at the Stanley Center for Peace and Security, where he oversees the climate team's work to limit global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Through policy dialogues, analysis, and outreach, and work with policymakers, civil society, and the private sector, Tang helps advance international policy and cooperation for a better climate future. He's also been a part of furthering initiatives such as the Powering Past Coal Alliance and the Marrakech Partnership for Global Climate Action. Before joining the Stanley Center, he worked in Washington, D.C., researching U.S. foreign policy and national security institutions. He has a BA in International Studies from American University. Mark Conway is also an associate program officer for the climate change at the Stanley Center for Peace and Security, where he supports the climate team's work to limit global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. In addition to advocating for specific policy action, Conway promotes collective action on international climate policy by connecting organizations, governments, and other stakeholders and decision makers. Before joining the Stanley Center, Conway was a fellow at the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and an international support associate at the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative. Conway has a BA in English and American Literature from the University of Illinois at Chicago and an MA in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. While at the Stanley Center, Conway has continued his education and training in the field, receiving certifications in climate change diplomacy and the specialized module for human health and climate change from the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. Ray and Mark, thank you for joining us today, and welcome to ICFRC.
Okay. Thanks, Megan. Thanks, everyone, for coming. We have a few colleagues around here, like Kelly and Amy over there, who will take some photographs for some organizational promotion. So what we're going to do is mostly talk about this through the lens of how we work. And so I'll just kind of introduce where our perspective comes from in terms of what we're engaged to on a day-to-day basis. Then we will, can you all hear me? Are we good? Okay. So I was just doing the thing where I talk about what I'm supposed to talk about. So we're going to introduce our perspective, what we do kind of on a day-to-day basis, and then I think we kind of go through a few things, which would be in international politics and climate change. How is that changing? I think one big thing will be that climate change is everything. So Mark will talk about that, as well as climate change requires everyone to act, and then also action on climate change has a deadline. And finally, I'll talk about how the international climate politics relates to you and what we do here in Iowa City. So to just give you some background in terms of our perspective, the Stanley Center for Peace and Security, we've been around for about 60 years. You might have heard about the Stanley family, and that's basically how we started. So Max and Betty Stanley in Muscatine made a fortune through furniture manufacturing and also engineering, and then started the Stanley Foundation about 60 years ago. And at that time, it was right after World War II. There was a lot of interest in ideas around world federalism, the United Nations, and things like that. So they started the foundation to promote dialogue kind of with various officials in the UN, track to discussions, things like that on the issues of the day. So I think a lot of that had to do with things like nuclear weapons and, kind of the beginnings of the UN system, genocide, all those kinds of issues. So that's the legacy that our organization comes from. And so today, our work on global issues includes climate change, preventing mass violence and atrocities, as well as looking at how to make the world safer while nuclear weapons and technology is changing. So Mark and I are in the climate change issue area. You probably heard from our biographies that we're focused on that 1.5 C temperature target, which is in the Paris Agreement. And the way that we work is through a lot of convening and analysis. So we work globally. We bring together stakeholders, either countries, international institutions. I think one thing that you'll find in climate change is that there's a lot more stakeholders involved in these conversations. So cities, states, regions, businesses, activists, campaigners, NGOs, what have you. So what we do is we look at where there's an opportunity for policy change, and then bringing together stakeholders around to figure out kind of what is the path forward here. So we've had a climate change issue area, so to speak, since 2014. Our focus is on the mitigation side. So in climate change policy, there's adaptation, which is how do you manage the effects of climate change, and then there's mitigation, which is how do you bring down emissions so that you can either slow down or stop climate change. So there's kind of three ways that we do that work. One is we look at developing pathways towards the 1.5 temperature target and how to generate collective action towards those pathways. Then another thing is linking climate change to other global policy areas, so embedding climate change more spread out across the international agenda. And then generating momentum toward international political moments on climate change. So last year in September, there was a UN, the Secretary General held a Climate Action Summit with a bunch of countries. And so a lot of the work that we do with that, as well as the Conference of the Parties, which is the main annual kind of climate meeting in the process called the UNFCCC, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So what we do in a lot of those is how do we bring in, at least our angle on it, is how do we bring in the kind of action that's going on at the subnational level, so like cities and states, provinces, as well as in the private sector, and the climate action coalitions that we're seeing forming, and how do they interface with kind of this process between the countries, or in parlance of the UN, the parties. So some examples of what this means includes so one kind of group that we work with, we call it Galvanizing the Groundswell Climate Action. And it's kind of a dialogue between the parties that are very interested, and then the non-state subnational action coalitions, as well as experts on how do we create this formal interface between the parties and the non-state subnational actors, and get the most out of it. So a lot of that has to do with showing that there is action happening, the change that is making, and then how to link that to the parties making a greater commitments on climate action. So one example of like how that manifests is the amount of mayors and governors around the world who showed up at the Paris Climate Conference COP21 in 2015. Delivering a message to the countries that they want a global agreement, that they're taking action, that there is a lot of movement, and that making that decision to have that global agreement is based on a change that's already taking place and where there is already political will and commitment. Another thing that we worked with is the Powering Past Coal Alliance. So in COP23, so that was 2017, there was a group of countries that formed an alliance that was basically about phasing out coal. So we did a lot of work in terms of setting up dialogues prior to that to kind of see like what is going on in the coal sector globally, where are the positions of various countries, what can they commit to, and what needs to be done. So that's kind of like a very important pathway. Probably the most important one right now is the coal sector. And then another example is with climate and health. Last year, Mark put together a meeting between kind of climate and health youth activists and what message they can deliver to that climate summit that was held in September that builds a health case for climate action. So a lot of that, for instance, is air pollution, either from power generation or transportation, or even forest fires. So things that we're not, though, just want to be clear, we don't know everything. We're not technical experts. We're international policy practitioners working on climate change. And we have to work with technical experts all over the place to be able to do what we do. So we might not know, for example, the carbon sequestration potential of various types of pine in Eastern Europe, or the chemical makeup to get a breakthrough in battery technology. But I think it's about taking this global perspective. Who needs to be in the room to advance action on land use and what we need to do to prevent deforestation or to promote forest restoration, that kind of thing. So the other thing is that we're not U.S. focused, so we really do take an international perspective. So there's probably a lot on your minds in terms of what's going on in the U.S. I think we have to have a perspective on that, but in terms of the details of that, we probably know more about some other countries than the U.S. and depending on the topic. And then I think the other thing is we don't work on individual behaviors, so we work on more of the system behind those and the governance of that. So, for example, I think one thing that people do work on is how do you get more people to buy like electric vehicles, but there's also the production and the infrastructure around electric vehicles as well, and then the kinds of modes of transportation that we choose. So I think we're more about making sure that if we are producing electric vehicles, the energy systems that we're running off of aren't like coal power, or that we do have other choices such as light rail and buses and things like that. So I think the final thing on this intro piece is that working climate change, it's very dynamic. There's so much change going on. It's hard to keep track of just in terms of the international politics of it. It's diverse. There's a lot of variety in terms of the kinds of people who show up at the table. Everyone from climate scientists, economists. Of course, we have diplomats and officials, but everything ranging from countries and foreign ministries to the environmental ministries, energy ministries, state governments, city governments, And then on the business side, there's various sectors. There's utilities. You have large purchasers of energy, like from tech companies like Google and Amazon or Apple. You have agriculture companies, you have large financial institutions. So the kinds of people that we bring around the table are labor unions as well, indigenous peoples, youth. It's just humongous. So I think that's the other thing about working climate change. That the issue is humongous. It often seems overwhelming. So one thing that that I would say is that I think that for us, we have personal thoughts on climate change, but those are things that we kind of ruminate, on our off time, which we're not really going to talk about. What we're going to talk about is really what we're focused on the day to day, which is kind of based on these goals that we're trying to achieve. So I'll hand it over to Mark to talk about just climate change is everything, and it requires everyone to act.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? All right, good. I've got my presentation on a computer here. Hopefully I have no technology issues like we've had in Iowa the last couple days, but let's see here. Yeah, thanks for having us. First of all, I do think it's great that we have community engagement on sort of international policy issues and foreign relations. I think that's something we can take for granted a little bit and focus too much on the national level picture and not realizing how that impacts us and how we impact other people. It's in fact something that is at the core of the Stanley Center, going back to Max and Betty Stanley, who believed that citizen engagement with these issues was really important for us to be able to have solutions. So I wanted to add how much we do value this sort of venue here and this sort of conversation that you all are able to bring together. So thank you. Yes, and I will sort of carry on with what Ray had said. How there really is no policy area or area in our life that is not impacted by climate change. And in some ways, that's not necessarily news. I mean, that's something people have probably realized for quite a while, but it was, long kind of an abstract thing, where people had difficulty seeing how that fit into their daily lives. I think that's something that's becoming increasingly tangible, especially as we start to see the impacts of climate change occurring today. It's clear how it impacts markets, or how it impacts health, or how it has to be a component of conversations on land use and agriculture, or basically just about anything. So though that's not news, it's increasingly evident, I think, to decision makers and key stakeholders as well. But they've probably had little to no engagement with the issue prior to that in many cases. So maybe as an example, one area that was in the news a bit ago for sort of its exposure to risks in climate change was the susceptibility of property, and in particular residential property, to climate impacts such as severe weather and rising seas. And that may also seem fairly obvious, but I guess what's not been looked at as much is how much that impacts mortgage lenders, how much that impacts insurance markets, how much those are connected to the broader financial system and can leak into our markets, our economies in ways similar to the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And in many ways that this is actually much larger than that. The scale at which this might be an issue, the susceptibility to climate impacts in this residential property area is far greater than the subprime mortgage crisis. It is also extend to the government in the U.S. It's something that we have, we're backing some of these products and some of these mortgages and insurance in ways that leaves us susceptible to them and also encourages more risky behavior. So you have all of a sudden these actors engaging in a way that's far more tangible than they had before, where it was this thing off in the distance, but now it's, okay, yes, we see how housing crisis can lead to a broader financial crisis, and we see how these risks could be happening in the next few years, and who needs to be in the room having these conversations are people in these insurance industries or asset managers or the likes of them. So let's see. So we can see, you start to see the financial sector beginning to take these risks seriously. You see actors. Ray talked a bit about the financial sector, and we'll talk a bit more in depth about the financial sector in a bit. But you see actors like BlackRock making announcements, talking about these things publicly, talking about how they're getting out of fossil fuels. And it might not be perfect yet, and some of these things are fairly complicated when you talk about $1 trillion under management. It's going to take some untangling, but it's a conversation. We've never been at that point in the past where asset managers are talking about toxic fossil fuel assets and how to get out of these markets. So it's in some ways promising to see that. And we've seen that those might not be the kind of decision makers we always think about in the international policy space, although in climate they are really, as Ray said, these non-party, non-state actors are key and are engaged quite a lot. But we see it also in fora like just a few weeks ago or just recently, Davos, the World Economic Forum. This is something that comes up and is spoken about, and how do we transition entire global economies out of these areas and do it in a way that doesn't harm people, do it in a way that's safe, do it in a way that's just. And so these are big conversations, but they're starting to creep into other areas where you might not have had climate as high on the agenda in the World Economic Forum previously, but now it is. And Ray mentioned another area, one that I've worked on more closely, that is increasingly talked about is climate and health, the connections between climate and health. And I think that's an area where it's easy for people to see. Again, health is something people care about. If you look at voters in the U.S., for instance, I know Ray said we're not U.S. focused, we're not, but it is often their top concern is health. To the extent that they see that impacted, that can become quickly a local issue for mayors, for governors, for leaders. And when that's connected with climate, all of a sudden they see they need to be talking about climate action, climate change. And so now it's infused in the conversation at a level it probably wasn't before. One of the biggest areas that's had a lot of attention is air pollution. There's in fact been quite a lot of movement on phase out of coal-fired power generation over air pollution more than climate, really, because people's concern is that they're dying prematurely because of this pollution, and that's where they see it, and that's where they've galvanized action. So it's kind of a part of that conversation, but it's not limited to that either. It's going to be just about everywhere in health, as you can imagine. We've got warmer temperatures, warmer weather that's going to cause droughts, it's cause heat strokes, cause non-communicable diseases. It's going to alter the nutritional content of staple crops, potentially. It will increase communicable diseases, vectors for zoonotic diseases will change. And so it's something that the health sector sees they need to take up as well. So we've been working with some of those multilateral institutions like the World Health Organization, our UN Development Program, saying climate action is, they see it too. Climate action is health action. If you're concerned about health outcomes, you need to be taking climate action now, and we need to be building solutions that incorporate those voices, incorporate ministers of health, not just ministers of environment, but ministers in health, and the creation of climate action plans to make sure we have equitable health outcomes that result in a better world, and not think about that later after we start taking climate action. We need the same from finance ministers. We need whole of government approaches to this issue. But it is something where we see it rising higher on the agenda, and that's been one of our goals with this 1.5C framework too, is to help connect these issues together in a way where we can really mobilize more action in the international community and beyond. So let me just mention technology here. I might have just lost my place, but yeah, where we see, Ray also mentioned a bit about the local level, and that's something that we also see as international policy. And I think that's something increasingly shifting writ large in policy, but in particular in climate change is something we've seen engagement from non-state actors, non-nation state actors in the UN climate change process, whether that's COP21 in Paris, but it's continued beyond there, is one of maybe the bright spots of where we see ambition. In some of those moments are mayors, governors, business leaders coming who really do want to take action and can put pressure on the international political piece. But it's more than just that as well. It's also these actors connecting across boundaries. It's helpful for cities to come together and for somebody in Amsterdam to communicate with somebody in Hanoi about how they're dealing with rising sea levels and how they can confront that, or business leaders to talk about how they can change their supply chains in a way that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. What you're getting out of it with coordination at this international level with multilateral or multinational corporations, or whether that's cities working in networks, like you may have heard of the C40 network, these mega cities who are taking action, or business leaders that have operations, in dozens of countries and can have huge impacts on overall markets and supply chains. So that's really important, but it's also, I think, in particular important in climate change because action is going to take place at some level at the local level. You're going to have to implement policy at the local level. So there has to be this sort of engagement across different levels as well. Business and mayors have to be talking to each other, but mayors and governors and national level leaders need to be talking to each other as well. And that can be really helpful. It can be a positive thing because these mayors and governors can show national governments that they can take ambition further, that they're not going to be on the hook for everything. If you take more action, here's how we as mayors can take this further and can increase. But we need you to come along with this federal policy because not everything locally is going to be connected. You might be able to have impacts on, implementing net zero transportation technology, or working with zoning to change how cities are laid out, but you probably don't have much influence over federal highway policy. You don't have much influence over energy as much. It might be produced somewhere else and coming into your city. You need national and state level policy to be aligned and coordinated in these ways. And so that's an area where it's also increasingly helpful to have these voices in the UN climate space. And so when you get down to hopefully some of the grittier work of implementation, which is where we're supposed to be moving after we get the Paris rulebook put together, that's the shift that we're supposed to see. It's a bit harder because I think a lot of these people have been spent dozens of years negotiating. They're used to negotiating rules. Now they have to take action, and we're starting to see that. We're seeing encouraging signs, but it's tricky. But that's where you need to be able to turn to somebody and say, well, if we need multinational corporations in the room, I as a head of government can then turn to that group that's also there and say, how do we take this along? How do you come with us and help us do X, Y, and Z, where it might really be out of control, out of the remit of what you think a national government typically does. So these sort of connections are helpful to have at that level too, and are going to be necessary when you start talking about how to implement. And I think they're very pertinent for elected officials too. I think that's where you can get some urgency, because if you don't take care of your constituents' health or something they notice immediately, you get voted out of office. That's where it's often doesn't come in with this, that's where it's often been, you've seen laggards, because it's like that is down the road. I won't really have to deal with that right now. What I want to know is how do I pay for groceries, or how do I X, Y, Z. But now it's becoming clear that this is something that could get you voted out of office, in a matter of a few years if you don't take it seriously. So I think it's sort of the bringing it back to the international piece. It's also something that's quite different. We look at a more collaborative and cooperative picture that's needed. I think a lot of folks are used to maybe a zero-sum kind of game in international politics, and that might not be fitting in other areas, but it works, and actors can engage in that way. And I think people often look to superpowers, big emitters like US and China, to take action. And while they should, there's often this sort of competitive element that can stall action. If that actor doesn't take action first, why should I take action? But it's not really fitting for this problem. And first of all, I kind of try to think of an analogy. I don't know if I have the perfect one, but it's kind of like if you were a smoker, maybe, and you decided that you weren't going to quit smoking until others around you quit smoking. But that wouldn't really make sense as far as you getting a benefit. You would get the immediate benefit if you quit smoking, right away, no matter if others did. If others did, you might get less secondhand smoke, and that would be good for others to quit as well. But your delaying action doesn't give you a benefit. And I think that's similar in the climate space, where it can be a little weird working in this space to hear that as an argument. Well, if they don't take action, and it's gotten to the point where, yes, there might be costs, but the benefits are so huge to taking action now that really you're only hurting yourself not taking action. So that sort of delay because somebody else isn't doing it, while you need them to come along, is not. It's really counterintuitive. You're shooting yourself in the foot with that. But it's also it takes more than just those big countries. Maybe they have a responsibility historically, and for the size of emissions that they're producing, yes, they should really go further, faster, and first. They should be leading the way. But what we saw was a focus on U.S.-China in the lead up to the Paris Agreement. It was a very encouraging sort of relationship, and it had this sort of competition element that was positive to who can lead on this and take it further and who's not left behind, in this sort of virtuous cycle. But it's not enough because this impacts everybody. To get Paris, to get that agreement, you really needed leadership from small island and developing states. You needed leadership from countries that were going to be impacted if warming above 1.5 C occurred. They would disappear into the ocean, or there would be drought. So these countries and coalitions like the High Ambition Coalition and climate vulnerable countries were able to push this forward and fill this out, where I think if it was just US and China, you would not have seen that ambitious agreement come together in that way, or perhaps not come together at all. So this is kind of it's not that it's necessarily new, and I think any issue area we work in, we like fostering cooperation and collaboration at the international space, but it is unique in that it's requisite in this climate space. You really need to figure that out, but you need to figure out how you do that, because international politics get in the way of that. And a lot of the stumbling blocks could be, it could be that though you need everybody moving, countries in East Africa maybe don't need to take as much mitigation action. They haven't been responsible. They're hardly a blip on the radar of actual emissions. They've suffered the impacts. They've had, a couple of tropical cyclones in Mozambique this last year, and a drought in Ethiopia, Somalia, moving into Kenya. Now with plagues of locusts coming with, and this is all to do with warming weather off the coast of Africa. So they're feeling these impacts, but they really, maybe their focus ought to be, as Ray alluded to earlier, the sort of adaptation element of it, not the how do you actually take action. And maybe resources need to be reallocated since they're not there, and there's others historically responsible. But then this gets complicated. How do you arrange this sort of thing so others aren't taking advantage of it, or you have these free riders or something. It can get, even though you're benefited by taking action, it makes the puzzle a lot more complex. But that's where we need to get. As I mentioned, Ray and I were just in Madrid for the Conference of the Parties this last December, where they're supposed to be finishing up the rule book. Conversations were a lot more contentious. And I think we're really going to have to focus this year and into COP26 in Glasgow on making that transition from just bickering about the rules to actually talking about how we cooperate to take action on climate. And that's going to be a key challenge, but I also think it's something where the Paris Agreement is uniquely designed to take that on. It's a sort of, it maybe doesn't have a bunch of teeth like other agreements, but it has that collaboration built in. So that's something that we really need to focus on. But I'll pass it back to Ray. Maybe I spoke a little too long for some closing thoughts.
So what you heard from Mark, I think, is going back to how is climate change changing international politics. So climate change is everything. It's all these things on the agenda, and then it's also multi-level. You need that multi-level governance, and it needs kind of this universal cooperation. So what I'll talk about kind of as the last point on our our question or our title is that climate change has a deadline. Now, the reason why is because of this 1.5 goal. If we didn't have it, then we could just have temperature increase into perpetuity. But the basic idea is that the 1.5 goal is considered the safe limit. So if we cross over that threshold, what happened in 2015, where the 1.5 goal was embedded into the Paris Agreement, was that the climate vulnerable countries thought that this was critical for their national survival. So on the basis of that, what you can do is you can break down then in terms of how much emissions are left that ends up getting to that temperature increase, and then how fast do we need to have a rate of emissions decline. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change releases these reports. They're huge scientific assessments that kind of go through a global process and basically looked at all the critical questions, the latest research, all those things. So they did a special report on 1.5 in 2018. And they basically said that we need to halve our emissions by 2030 and then get to basically net zero emissions by mid-century, 2050, if we want to be in the 1.5 limit. So that is, that's pretty striking, to say the least. And, and that's where you hear things like, we have 10 years to turn this around. So I think that's about the policies that you put in place in the next 10 years really have to do that, halving emissions. And so I think that there are a few ways that, you can kind of look at how countries then approach that problem. And so one of them is like a net zero target by 2050. So a part of the Paris Agreement. So I think the whole Paris deal, basically the way it works is that the temperature target is 1.5. All countries basically make these pledges in terms of how much they're going to take climate action and reduce their emissions. And every 5 years, they ratchet that up. So this year, at the end of this year, we're going to have that ratchet for the first time. Along with that is like a net zero target. So do you have a long-term plan to get to zero emissions by 2050? So one example of kind of how, we're kind of observing the national politics of it is that you have these big coalitions that are forming, like the Climate Ambition Alliance, where it's something like 120 countries, have made that pledge to submit a long-term plan for 2050. Now that has to be backed up by their pledges this year as well. But I think it often gets lost that that there are a lot of countries that are taking a lot of action that's substantial, and then you have these like major economies, of course, like the U.S. And I think China, and I think, who basically, are not really coming out as strongly about the action that they're taking. And so that's the dynamic that we need to be dealing with. So another element of, I guess, getting even more deeper into implementation is how do you break down this problem? So so you can break it down by the emission source. So you have like the electricity sector, transportation, buildings, industry, agriculture, forests. Those are kind of like the EPA kind of sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And then, so I think if you look at that, you could say like, okay, the electricity sector is kind of like where the most emissions are coming from. Where are the most emissions coming from within that? And that would be coal power. So we think it's critical that that coal power generation basically has to end as quickly as possible. And so when we look into that, then what are the things that we need? Then we need to stop new coal. So there's still like a coal pipeline that's getting built out. And then we need to phase out coal, and then we need to not go from coal to gas. It has to go to clean energy immediately. So this is kind of what brings us to things like the Powering Past Coal Alliance. So you have this pathway that's very firm, and so a part of the commitment that we have this coalition make is they're going to stop building new coal. They're going to develop countries have to phase out coal by 2030, and then developing countries phase out by 2050, and you have to stop coal finance. And I think looking at just the I guess the technical part of it is that I think the story is really it's very hard to see kind of with the amount of planned coal capacity that we have right now, how much that we're going to be able to make it. Basically, we have to stop coal right now. So there's still a lot of coal build out in China and Southeast Asia, but at the same time, in the U.S., the rate of retirements on coal plants is like faster than it was during the Obama administration. So even if we ended the war on coal, it's still spiraling. And then I think with those rate of retirements, we'll actually, if we continue on that rate, we can phase out by 2030 in the U.S. And this is not just because of the economics, but because of what a lot of campaigners and activists and movements have put into doing that, making an effort on that. It's similar in the EU, I think. And then in terms of stopping coal, I think this kind of global pipeline, it's basically dropped 70% since 2015. So that is huge. So there really is a huge signal that something is changing in the energy transition. And then we need to go from there to clean energy, in which case we really need to promote renewables, and that has to beat out gas. And if you look at kind of the growth in renewables around the world, as well as the cost competitiveness of renewables, we're kind of right in that place, which I'll talk about, I think, in more detail in what we're seeing in like Southeast Asia. So that's kind of so the big thing is that we need to get to zero emissions by 2050. Then you can kind of break it down into a sector and look at the dynamics there. And then you can look at kind of what are the leverage points. So Mark was talking about like BlackRock. So financial institutions are a huge part of it. So if we're making this kind of more implementation play, then what we're finding is that you start out with air pollution. So obviously, like you can see images from China or even Southeast Asia, India, and you can see all the smog, from this coal power generation. A lot of that actually kind of starts the resistance in public opinion that moves against coal energy. And then, but then on the other hand, or on the other side of it, then you need to intervene with more on the financial decision making. So what we're finding is that if people are making the case, especially activists, in like shareholder meetings, that building this project out is going to be a huge risk to their portfolio and to investment institutions' reputation, that is effective, that they can basically get kind of large investment banks that want to do a deal will move away from it. And then that builds out to then, okay, why don't we just look at our whole portfolio and get out of coal? So I think that movement's kind of built up with like BlackRock and the decision they made, and I think you can push that further. And then, for example, there's a Japanese institution that did this, I think last year, Marubeni, and so that's kind of where the projects stop. And so those are like the leverage points, and where we kind of at a more of an implementation phase are kind of focusing on. And then I think the third piece is like the various geographic areas. So Mark was talking about, so you have all these cities and mayors and governors and so forth. So in Southeast Asia, where kind of the biggest worry is in terms of the build out of coal generation, I think this is around like 60, 70 gigawatts right now, is that, and where I think if you listen to like the financial papers or like the business papers in Southeast Asia, like 3 years ago, they'd be like, okay, we're going to build all this coal, basically. It's all there. That pipeline's going to get built out. But more and more what we're seeing is that some of these like provinces in like Vietnam, in the Philippines, where the national governments basically say, we're going to build all this coal because we need to develop our economies. And a lot of these kind of provinces, we're seeing them basically cancel a bunch of these coal projects because they find that renewable energy is cheaper and more reliable, and it has more local support. And what we're finding from there is that the markets change in these countries. So then, that kind of spooks the national government, and they're surprised, and they're like, okay, 2 years later, they look at kind of what their energy policy should be, and they're like, okay, maybe we don't need to build all this stuff. We're going to prioritize renewable energy now. So that subnational piece, how it interacts with the health piece, the finance piece, the market changes are all critical, and then that builds up to these national decisions. And then we're trying to see what kind of international plays can be made now. So one example is that a few days ago, the Powering Past Coal Alliance basically signed an agreement with Vietnam that they wouldn't build any more coal power, and that that alliance would help them with basically just going to renewable energy and leapfrogging coal power generation and building that out. I think that there's also another piece of this to worry about is large financial institutions in China, Japan, and South Korea. So I don't know how familiar you might be with like the Belt Road Initiative of China, but it is like kind of this huge development program that basically the big state banks and policy banks are financing infrastructure around the world. And a lot of that is going to the global coal pipeline. So I think one challenge for us is to figure out how to, realign that towards the energy transition. And I don't have a lot of answers for it right now. We're trying some things, but just I think that shows kind of how that geopolitics starts coming into play. I think the last thing in terms of like the kind of issues that are there that we need to address in implementation are one is just transition. So this is, I guess in the past, like, a couple of years, or even the past year, you've had these demonstrations in Chile. You had the Gilets jaunes, and in France, that had to do with the gas tax. Chile, it also had to do, I think, something similar to that. Or you even have, the coal sector workers in West Virginia, right, in the U.S. So basically what this has to do with is in the energy transition, are we creating a lot of these social disruptions that are going to be where we're going to face a backlash? And so one thing that I think is really important is that we're looking at not just how to make that transition happen technically or in the marketplace, but also that, there's various stakeholders involved in terms of how that happens, a safety net for the workers that would get displaced, and regional development programs for the communities that need to find another way to make a living. So one example of how this has played out in the coal sector is that Germany has a coal phase-out date. There was a huge coal commission, a national coal commission, and they basically brought together, the climate movement, the regions that would be affected, the utilities, and the labor kind of groups, and they had a deal. This is kind of an economic package. But at the same time, we'll give you this economic package, and we'll get this phase out by this date. So that was 2038, which to us is still too late. But that also signals that coal is going to end, and so that allows for the activists to push further, and as well, the market can change faster because they know that that's going to happen. So why not just get out of coal immediately and build renewables? Another thing that's interesting kind of going forward is litigation. So we're looking at like the Exxon New kind of campaign. And so it basically has to do with a fraud case against Exxon where they basically lied about climate change to their shareholders. We're also seeing litigation across borders. So for example, you have a Peruvian farmer suing a German utility when there's kind of like this glacier melt that's affecting his crops. And then I think the other thing is around refugees. So in the UN Human Rights Council, just recently there was a resolution passed saying that climate refugees count as human rights refugees. So I think feels like we're all I want to say is to end this. This is going further than I thought, longer than I thought, is that I think what happens in Iowa City does matter, and it does interact with the international politics based on all this change. So I think the climate action plan that was passed here, as well as the climate strikes, these are things that can be linked up with other cities, other localities, other initiatives, and they can build up to greater things. Like we are still in coalition in the U.S. that goes through the climate change conferences and says to other countries that we have 2/3 of the United States, 80% of emissions still committed to the Paris Agreement and meeting that goal, which is very important for other countries to hear. So I think that's one thing to take away is like, how can we all act? And so I think thinking about the institutions that we have around here, high school, university, businesses, how can they take action? And all that matters, and all that adds up to the international process, and it really does affect it. So that's what I would leave with you with in terms of I think how that all matters to you at the end of the day. Thanks.
All right. Thank you guys very much. It was a great presentation. We still have a few minutes, so we'll take a few questions. If you need to get going, that's understandable. Just please be quiet. So for the first question we have for you is, in light of everything you talked about, can you share your thoughts with us on the Green New Deal?
Do you want me to do that in the mic? Okay.
Yeah, please.
So I think my first reaction to the Green New Deal is that it's incredible to see it as something that's in the national discussion now. I think looking at even the presidential election like 4 years ago, climate change was not really at the top of the agenda, and so I think one thing that shows is that there is this momentum building for it. In terms of the specifics of it, I think. I think anyone can have criticisms of it based on, I think, a lot of specifics as well as how much it costs. But at the end of the day, seeing that kind of energy and then what I can do with it in terms of talking to people in other countries is a huge advantage. So even just people thinking that the political winds can change in the U.S. on climate change, and if that is the Green New Deal, that message matters a lot, I think, when we go to a climate negotiation or something like that.
Okay, so another person would like to ask you, although you don't work on U.S. issues specifically, they'd like you to comment on action by Iowa mayor on climate and the action or non-action of Governor Reynolds. And also, do you specifically work directly in contact with Iowa officials?
No, we don't do anything with Iowa, but I would say that seeing the action happening in your local community is definitely something that I can talk about as a personal story. And seeing our high school climate strikers bring out so many people and bring Greta Thunberg here, I think there's something where if you're looking at the U.S. from the outside, you can see, okay, maybe the mayor of New York who's going to take this, climate action seriously because people there believe in climate change and all that. But when you say, Iowa City is doing it, they're like, what's Iowa? That's in the middle, right? Like, I don't know anything about it, and that's kind of the part of the country where I have the most questions and doubts about. So I think being able to say that it's not just like the coast, but even within a place like Iowa, and also being a swing state, and where we hold their caucuses, and seeing that climate change is an issue at play, in the heartland, so to speak, is a powerful message. In terms of the state, I think the renewable energy mix is really interesting to see. So, what is it, like 35 to 45% of our power generation is wind energy now, which I think is like one of the highest in the U.S. In terms of the percentage of power generation for a state. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity here, and definitely something that I think, in terms of the local discussion around climate change, to really raise awareness around that Iowa's actually in a really well-positioned place in terms of energy. I think on the agriculture side, it's more difficult because of ethanol and the environmental impacts of the way that we do our agriculture. But I do think that on the energy side, that there's a lot of opportunities that I think, having climate change raised on the agenda can really allow us to be positioned well on that.
All right, so we'll do one more really quick. There's a lot of great questions. Hopefully you all get a chance to speak with Ray and Mark afterwards. But to finish things off, you guys work very closely with this issue. So for you personally, what is your sense of urgency surrounding this issue, and maybe a sense of hope as well?
Yeah, I guess personally, I kind of got into this. I'm from Iowa originally. I've been elsewhere for a lot of the last 10 years or so, but it's seeing all of the different environmental impacts through specifically a lot of the agriculture and land use sector, and that's what's drawn me in, and it's an incredibly complex picture. It's one where if you move one thread, it affects a whole lot of other things, and I think it's somewhat we really need to be focused on. So that's something that kind of drives me. I can see that personal connection. I can see the importance of that internationally, but I can also see that here. I live in Iowa City. I can see that here just up the road. I can understand how that impacts and how I can engage with it. And so I think that is something that is important. I think what motivates me is seeing if I ended with this maybe negative, where do we go from here? How are we going to figure this out? What's encouraging and what's good is the groundswell of action you have high schoolers and students taking this on. You have people in the health sector talking about it. You have people across different sectors, across different issues, engaging with this, and it rising up, and there being a lot of ambition and a lot of action there. And so that is something that really, I think that we are turning the corner on harnessing some of that ambition in really positive ways. We would like to push it a little faster, but it is it's something where you can derive a lot of hope seeing how many people are engaged in positive ways, and I think how close we are to some very, very positive action.
Sorry.
Sorry. So I think the biggest challenge personally is just like it's just so much to comprehend. It's pretty much incomprehensible. You can't wrap your hands around it. I mean, even in terms of trying to talk about it from us, it's a lot to throw out there. We could have done even more than that. And I think, but at the same time, it's an issue that does connect you around the world. So I think that's what's most interesting. It's the issue of our time. And so, it's not just that you do something and it has an effect here, but it has an effect for everyone, and you can see your actions linked with everyone else's, all over. And so I think people realizing that and that bringing more energy into climate action and really, taking it seriously and being a political issue, I think that's kind of what gives me the most encouragement.
All right. Thank you both very much for the wonderful presentation. We're going to conclude our program, but just some final thoughts. We want to thank our sponsors once again, the University of Iowa Honors Program, University of Iowa Public Policy Center, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their support. And we also thank today's special sponsor, which was an anonymous donation in honor of Ed Zestro. Just to wrap things up, Ray and Mark, as a small token of our appreciation, we want to present you with the coveted Iowa City Foreign Relations mug. Thank you for joining us, and we are adjourned.